The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The plains stretched endlessly, golden grasses swaying in the soft evening breeze. Somewhere in this quiet, lonely expanse stood a small wooden cabin, barely more than a shelter, yet sturdy enough to hold its secrets and protect those inside. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, carrying the scent of burning wood into the calm air. For anyone passing by, it might have looked like a simple homestead, but tonight it held more than a fire. It held a story of fear, trust, and survival. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense, yet strangely comforting. A young woman sat near the small fireplace, her legs drawn close to her chest. She was wearing a shirt that did not belong to her, one borrowed from the man who had saved her. The fabric hung loosely on her shoulders, a silent reminder of the night before when everything had changed. She had been alone, frightened, and exhausted, when he had appeared like a shadow in the darkness. His calm, steady presence had pulled her from danger, and now, as she sat wrapped in his shirt, a sense of safety mingled with the lingering fear in her chest. The cowboy moved quietly around the cabin, checking the windows and the door. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, like someone who had lived through countless nights of danger. He was tall, with a rugged face and eyes that seemed to see everything. Even in the fading light, his presence was commanding, a silent assurance that as long as he was near, she would not be alone. Yet behind that calm exterior, his mind was racing, calculating, measuring every risk. He knew the stories on the wind. He had heard whispers of a large group moving through the plains, a group that would not stop for anyone. By now, he suspected that this threat was close, far too close to ignore. He crouched beside the fireplace and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "It's not safe to make a sound. Not yet." His words were firm but gentle, carrying the weight of someone used to responsibility. The young woman nodded. Though her heart thumped so loudly, she feared he might hear it. She wanted to ask questions, so many questions. But something in his eyes told her that now was not the time for talking. Instead, she wrapped the shirt tighter around herself, grounding herself in the warmth it offered. Outside, the plains seemed to stretch endlessly, beautiful but dangerous, holding secrets and threats alike. The cowboy moved to the small window, pressing his hand lightly against the glass. Through it, he could see the last rays of the sun fading into twilight. The tall grasses rustled in the wind, but there was something more. Movement. Not far off, shadows shifted, and he instinctively knew they were not alone. His jaw tightened. Stories of danger could often be ignored when far away, but tonight he knew better. A large group was coming, moving with purpose. Perhaps they were seeking someone, or something. Perhaps they were simply a force of nature, unstoppable and unforgiving. Either way, he could not let them find the young woman inside the cabin. He turned back to her, his face calm but serious. "You need to stay quiet. No matter what you hear or see, if they find you, it could mean the end." She swallowed hard, nodding again, trying to steady the trembling in her hands. Fear was one thing. Panic could be fatal. She had learned quickly that this man did not exaggerate danger, and that made her trust him even more. He was not just a protector. He was a guide through the unknown, someone who knew how to survive when everything around them seemed against them. The cabin itself, though small, became a character in its own right. Its walls were thick with timber, strong enough to offer protection, yet they creaked slightly under the weight of the evening breeze. The cowboy moved around, checking the latch on the door, reinforcing the small barricade he had set up earlier. Each nail, each plank, each careful adjustment was a silent declaration. They were not going down without a fight. The young woman watched him, feeling a strange mix of awe and comfort. There was something almost magnetic about the way he worked, steady hands moving with purpose, mind calculating every possibility. Outside, darkness fell quickly. The sky turned deep indigo, stars beginning to flicker like distant lanterns. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and earth, but it also carried danger. The cowboy peered through the window again, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Shadows grew longer, merging into one another. Somewhere in the distance, he caught glimpses of figures moving, too many to count, moving with quiet coordination, like a wave that would soon crash over them. His instincts told him this was not a small threat. This was a force he would need all his skill and knowledge to outsmart. He returned to the fireplace, kneeling beside it once more. His hands moved with precision, adjusting small stones and the burning wood to control the light and warmth. He knew that even the smallest glow could give them away if their pursuers were near. Every sense was alert. Every sound, every shadow, every shift of the wind could signal danger. He glanced at the young woman again. Her eyes were wide but determined, reflecting a courage that surprised even him. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You're doing fine. Just keep calm." Minutes stretched into hours. The young woman found herself counting the slow tick of time, listening to the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. The cabin, once just a shelter, became a world of its own, a place where silence held meaning and every shadow held a story. She thought of how fragile their situation was. A single sound, a single wrong movement, could change everything. And yet, despite the fear, there was a strange beauty in this moment. The quiet between the chaos, the bond forming between two people in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and dangerous. The cowboy moved again, crouching near the door, listening. His experience told him the warriors outside would not rush blindly. They would surround, they would wait, they would test. And he was ready. He had prepared for nights like this, though each one carried its own uncertainties. He felt the weight of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the young woman who trusted him completely. His eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. This trust was not given lightly, and he would honor it with every ounce of his skill and courage. As night deepened, the plains became a silent, watching audience. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying secrets and signals alike. Somewhere in the darkness, the approaching threat moved like a living shadow, their numbers unknown, but their intent clear. Inside the cabin, the cowboy and the young woman existed in a bubble of careful stillness, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. It was a delicate balance between fear and hope, danger and protection, uncertainty and trust. And then, just as the stars burned brightest overhead, a faint sound broke the near-perfect silence. Not a shout, not a command, but a subtle disturbance. A shift in the grass outside, almost imperceptible. The cowboy's hand moved instinctively to the young woman's shoulder. He whispered, "Stay quiet, now more than ever." She nodded, heart racing, feeling the enormity of the moment. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside, the fire crackled softly, a beacon of warmth and life in the midst of an encroaching threat. The first part of the night had passed, and though the danger loomed, the young woman felt something she had not felt in a long time: safety. Not complete safety, not permanent safety, but the knowledge that she was not alone, that someone who knew how to navigate the wild and the dangerous was there, standing between her and the unknown. The cowboy's presence was more than protection. It was a promise that no matter what was coming, they would face it together. And so, as the wind whispered through the endless plains and the first night shadows deepened, the cabin held its secrets and its occupants. Outside, the unknown waited. Inside, trust, courage, and quiet determination filled the small space. The night was far from over, but for now they had survived the first hour, and in that, there was hope. The night had grown darker, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny, cold diamonds. Outside the cabin, the plains that had seemed quiet and endless in the evening now held a different energy, a low, tense hum that seemed almost alive. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying with it a faint rustle that made the young woman's heart skip a beat. She pressed herself closer to the fire, trying to remember the cowboy's words. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear or see. She could feel the weight of those words settling in her chest, a heavy but necessary responsibility. The cowboy moved silently around the cabin, his eyes scanning the shadows outside each window. Every movement he made was deliberate, precise, and careful. He checked the doors, ensuring the latch was secure, then examined the small cracks in the wooden walls. He listened. Each creak of the cabin, each whisper of the wind, could mask something far more dangerous. He was not just protecting the cabin, he was protecting her, and he knew that any small mistake could change everything. The young woman stayed low, hugging her knees, trying to remain invisible. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. She could hear the soft crackle of the fire, the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards, and the rhythmic sound of the wind. Yet beneath these ordinary noises, she could sense something more, something larger, more menacing. She had never faced a threat like this before. The stories she had heard in towns and villages never truly prepared her for the feeling of being completely surrounded, completely vulnerable. And now, with a man she barely knew guiding her, she realized how fragile life could be. The cowboy crouched by one of the windows, peering through the small cracks between the planks. Far off, in the darkness beyond the flickering firelight, he saw them. Shadows moving together with a careful purpose. It was not just a group of men. It was a coordinated force, silent and relentless. He had counted, or at least tried to, and though the exact number was impossible to be certain of, he estimated at least 400. 400 armed men moving through the plains, encircling the cabin with the intent to capture or destroy anything that moved. He turned back to the young woman, his face calm but serious. "They're surrounding us," he said quietly, his voice steady, giving her a sense of control even in the worst circumstances. "We cannot make a sound, not a whisper, not a step. If they hear us, we have no chance." She nodded, her fingers gripping the shirt around her shoulders, her knuckles white. Fear was still there, clawing at her chest, but alongside it was a strange mixture of trust. He had saved her before. He could save her again. Outside, the shadows grew closer. The movement of the warriors was careful and deliberate, as if they knew instinctively that the cabin held someone important or valuable. The cowboy moved to the small kitchen area, gathering a few supplies silently, a water skin, a small knife, and a few pieces of rope. Every tool could be useful if they needed to make a quick escape. He returned to the window, pressing his forehead lightly against the glass, watching for any sign of the approaching danger. The young woman tried to stay calm, focusing on her breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. She could hear the faint sound of the wind bending the grasses outside, carrying the distant sounds of men whispering to one another. Her imagination wanted to fill in the details, louder voices shouting, the sound of galloping horses. But she forced herself to remain in reality. Each sound had to be analyzed, measured. A single wrong move could give them away. Hours passed like this. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable, yet it was broken occasionally by small, human moments. The cowboy would glance back at her, giving a reassuring nod or a small gesture to let her know that he had everything under control. At one point, he adjusted the fire to cast less light on the windows, minimizing the chance of being seen. He moved silently, every step calculated, a man who had survived countless dangerous nights. She marveled at his skill and focus, feeling both admiration and gratitude. Despite the calm exterior, the cowboy's mind was racing. He knew that 400 warriors were more than a number. They were a force. They could wait, they could attack, they could surround every possible escape route. The question was not if they would strike, but when. And when they did, the young woman's life depended on every decision he made in the next few hours. He checked the doors again, tested the windows, and ensured that the small barricade of logs and furniture he had set up would provide at least some obstacle if someone tried to break in. Every detail mattered. Outside, the warriors shifted in the night. Their movements were quiet but deliberate, a subtle choreography that revealed their experience and discipline. They circled the cabin, sometimes stopping to peer through the darkness, testing the boundaries. Occasionally, the wind would carry a faint sound of a soft command or a rustle of boots through the grasses. The young woman's heart would leap each time, and she would press herself closer to the floor, wishing she could make herself disappear entirely. The cowboy whispered to her again, "If they come inside, we'll need to move quickly, but for now, stay still. Trust me." She nodded, trusting him completely, though she did not know exactly what he planned. She realized that survival in this moment was not just about courage, it was about patience, focus, and listening. Even a small whisper could undo all their efforts. Hours continued to pass, and the night seemed endless. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The cabin, once a safe haven, now felt like a fragile bubble surrounded by uncertainty. Yet inside that bubble, there was also trust, courage, and the silent bond between two people facing a threat far greater than themselves. The cowboy worked quietly, sometimes adjusting a trap he had prepared earlier, sometimes checking for any sign of weakness in the surrounding area. His experience had taught him that danger often came in small, unpredictable ways, and he would not underestimate the warriors outside. The young woman found herself observing him more closely. She noticed the way his eyes scanned every detail, the way his hands moved with quiet precision, the calm confidence in his posture. There was a certain beauty in his focus, a quiet strength that was both reassuring and inspiring. She realized that bravery was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and persistent, like the cowboy moving silently through the cabin. Then, just as the night seemed its darkest, a faint sound broke through the silence. Not a shout, not a command, but a subtle movement in the grasses outside. The cowboy froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon through the small cracks in the window. The young woman's heart raced. She pressed herself against the floor, listening intently. The movement continued, soft, deliberate, and measured. It was a reminder that the warriors were still out there, still watching, still waiting for any sign of weakness. The cowboy knelt beside her, his hand lightly on her shoulder. "Remember," he whispered, "stay silent. Trust me. We'll get through this." She nodded, clinging to his words. Fear was still there, but alongside it was something else, determination. They were trapped, yes, but not powerless. As long as they remained calm, as long as they remained silent, they had a chance. Night continued to stretch on, and the wind carried whispers of movement from beyond the cabin. The warriors' presence was unmistakable, their numbers overwhelming, yet they had not yet found a way in. Inside, the cowboy and the young woman waited, relying on patience, skill, and trust. Every moment was filled with tension, yet also with the quiet assurance that they were not alone, that they were not helpless. The first part of the night had been survived, and now the second wave of hours began. The cowboy continued his watch, moving with careful precision, while the young woman stayed low, listening and learning. Outside, The shadows of the warriors crept closer, circling the cabin like a tide, ready to strike at any moment. Inside, the fire flickered softly, illuminating the determination and courage of two people facing an overwhelming force together. The night was far from over. The threat was real, close, and relentless. But inside the small cabin, in the middle of a vast, dangerous plain, a quiet determination held strong. The cowboy and the young woman had survived the first part of the siege, and now, as darkness pressed in on all sides, they prepared for the hours ahead. Every sound mattered. Every movement counted. And above all, they knew that silence, trust, and courage would be their greatest weapons against the overwhelming force surrounding them. The night had grown colder, and the wind swept through the plains like a restless spirit. Outside the cabin, shadows moved with quiet purpose, brushing against the tall grasses and disappearing as quickly as they appeared. The young woman huddled near the fire, her shirt hanging loosely over her shoulders, a fragile shield against the chill and against the fear that gnawed at her heart. Her eyes were wide, alert to every sound, every movement, every whisper carried on the wind. She had been trained, in a way, by the cowboy's calm instructions, but now, hours into the night, fatigue threatened to pull her into panic. The cowboy remained vigilant, moving silently around the cabin, checking every corner, every door, and every window. His experience in the wild had taught him that danger could arrive without warning, that the quietest moments could hide the greatest threats. Even now, with the fire casting warm, flickering light across the room, his mind was calculating. How had 400 men managed to surround this remote cabin so efficiently? How could he keep the young woman safe when the odds seemed impossibly against them? And most importantly, how could they survive until morning? He crouched by the window and peered through the cracks. The movement outside was almost imperceptible. Yet he could see enough to know the warriors were testing the perimeter, gauging every detail of the cabin, every possible entry point. Some were still distant, forming a wide circle in the open plains, while others crept closer, moving as shadows among the tall grass. He knew that each of these men could strike with precision if given a chance. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm when he whispered, "Stay low. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens." The young woman pressed herself against the floor, her ears straining to catch every sound. Her heart beat rapidly, and for a moment she wondered how anyone could survive in a situation like this. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, yet she clung to the cowboy's words like a lifeline. She had no choice but to trust him. He had saved her once. He could save her again. Every movement he made was deliberate, and she noticed the small gestures. The careful way he adjusted the fire, the way he checked the door latch, the way he scanned the horizon for danger. In those small actions, she found a strange comfort, a reassurance that they were not alone in this fight. Outside, the warriors shifted like a tide, encircling the cabin with patient precision. Their numbers were overwhelming, yet they moved quietly, deliberately, as though they understood the value of stealth. The cowboy knew that any rash move could trigger a disaster. He crouched low, listening to the wind and the distant rustle of grass, reading the subtle signs of the approaching threat. He could sense their strategy forming, the way they sought to surround and isolate the cabin before making a move. It was a dangerous game of patience, and the cowboy knew that survival depended on staying calm and acting with precision. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. The young woman's body ached from staying in one position for so long, but she dared not move. She had learned to read the cowboy's subtle gestures, understanding when to remain perfectly still and when to follow his instructions. He adjusted his position near the door, listening intently, then whispered, "They're close. Keep calm. Breathe slowly." She followed his advice, forcing herself to focus on her breath, on the slow rise and fall of her chest. Fear was still there, but alongside it was a quiet determination. They were not helpless. They were prepared. The cowboy moved to the fireplace and adjusted the logs, keeping the light low to avoid detection. Each movement was careful, calculated to maintain warmth and visibility without revealing their position. He checked the small traps he had set earlier, ensuring they were still effective. Outside, the warriors tested the area again, sending a few men closer to the cabin, probing for weaknesses. The cowboy's eyes followed each shadow, his mind calculating the next move. He could see the potential paths they might take, the places they could hide, and the ways they could be distracted. Every possibility mattered. The young woman watched him with a mix of fear and admiration. She realized that bravery was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and deliberate. The cowboy's calm presence gave her strength, even when the threat outside seemed insurmountable. She took note of how he listened, how he moved, how he assessed danger without panicking. In his actions, she found a model for courage, something she could try to emulate, even in the midst of overwhelming fear. A subtle shift in the shadows caught the cowboy's attention. A small group of warriors had moved closer, testing the barricade he had set up at the door. He remained perfectly still, letting the tension build as the men examined the perimeter. The young woman held her breath, heart pounding, as he whispered, "Wait. Do not move. Let them come closer." Seconds stretched into minutes as the warriors lingered, unaware of the traps and the careful strategy waiting for them inside. The night seemed endless, yet the cowboy remained focused. He moved with purpose, adjusting small details in the cabin, reinforcing weak points, and maintaining the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. Outside, the warriors began to shift again, spreading out and probing different areas, yet none discovered the subtle defenses he had prepared. Every movement was a test, and every moment was an opportunity to survive. The young woman began to notice her own courage growing. Each time she followed his instructions, each time she resisted the urge to panic, she felt a small victory within herself. She realized that survival was not just about hiding, it was about learning, observing, and acting with care. The cowboy's guidance was her lifeline, and in following him, she discovered a resilience she had never known existed. Time continued to stretch, and the wind carried whispers from the distant warriors. The cowboy's senses were attuned to every sound, every movement, every subtle change in the environment. He could anticipate their actions, predict their strategies, and prepare for their next move. His focus was unbreakable, and he communicated calm through every word, every gesture, every glance. The young woman found herself relying on his presence more than ever, understanding that their survival depended on trust and patience. Then, a sudden shift in the shadows drew their attention. A larger group of warriors had moved closer, testing multiple points around the cabin simultaneously. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to assess the threat. He whispered to the young woman, "Stay perfectly still. Watch me and copy my movements if you must." She nodded, following his instructions as he moved silently to adjust the traps and reinforce the barricades. The tension was unbearable, yet every action they took was precise, deliberate, and necessary. The night pressed on, the stars now high and cold above the plains. Outside, the warriors circled like a tide, relentless and patient, yet they had not discovered the full extent of the cowboy's preparations. Inside the cabin, each breath, each movement, each quiet decision was a victory. The young woman realized that bravery was not just about facing danger, it was about surviving it, and about learning to trust in someone who knew how to navigate the peril. Hours passed like a slow, unending rhythm. The cowboy moved constantly, checking the barricades, adjusting the fire, listening for the faintest sound outside. The young woman stayed low, silent, and focused, learning from him not just how to survive the night, but how to endure fear without letting it dominate her mind. The connection between them deepened, built not on words or shared stories, but on shared experience and trust. Finally, as the night began to stretch toward its final hours, the cowboy allowed himself a brief moment to glance at the young woman. She was pale but alert, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. He gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. She returned it, understanding that they were in this together, that survival required more than hiding. It required patience, focus, and the courage to face each hour as it came. Outside, the warriors continued their slow, methodical approach, unaware of the careful planning, the traps, and the quiet strategy that had been prepared inside the cabin. The night was far from over, but for now, the pair had survived yet another test. The tension remained, but so did the trust, the courage, and the determination that would carry them through the hours ahead. As the wind whispered through the endless plains and the shadows shifted silently, the cabin held its secrets and its occupants. Inside, the cowboy and the young woman remained vigilant, each aware of the stakes, each understanding the delicate balance between fear and survival. The night pressed on, testing their patience, their focus, and their courage, yet they endured. And in that endurance they discovered that even in the face of overwhelming danger, trust and determination could illuminate a path through the darkness. The night had reached its darkest hour, and the air outside the cabin felt heavy with anticipation. The plains stretched endlessly, and the shadows of the 400 warriors moved like a tide around the small wooden cabin. Every rustle of grass, every distant footstep, every whisper of the wind carried a sense of danger. The young woman remained close to the fire, her shirt still draped over her shoulders, a faint comfort against the fear that gnawed at her. Her heart pounded continuously, but she tried to focus, reminding herself of the cowboy's words. Stay calm, stay silent, and trust me. The cowboy crouched by the window, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin walls. His eyes were sharp, trained to notice the slightest movement, the smallest shadow, the tiniest clue of danger. He had been watching the warriors for hours, observing their patterns, studying their behavior, and quietly preparing for the moment when patience alone would no longer be enough. He knew that the night was only half over, and that the longer they waited, the more likely the warriors would grow impatient and aggressive. Every second mattered. He returned to the young woman crouching beside her. "We can't stay here forever," he said softly, careful not to alarm her. "They will test the cabin again, and eventually waiting will not be enough. We need a plan to move or distract them. I have an idea, but it will require both of us to act quickly and carefully." She looked at him, a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes. She nodded, trusting him completely, ready to follow his lead even in the face of danger. The cowboy began to prepare. He moved silently, gathering a few items he had brought with him earlier: a small knife, a coil of rope, and a lantern with a flickering flame. Each tool could be used strategically. He reinforced the barricades at the door and windows, creating obstacles that would slow anyone who tried to force entry. He also set a few minor traps around the cabin, simple, clever adjustments to the environment that could create distractions or slow down intruders. Every move was carefully thought out, designed to buy them time and give them an advantage over the overwhelming numbers outside. The young woman watched him closely, absorbing every detail. She realized that survival was not just about hiding. It was about strategy, observation, and patience. The cowboy's calm focus gave her courage, and she began to understand that bravery could take many forms. It was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and careful, like the movements of a man who knew how to survive against impossible odds. Outside, the shadows shifted again, The warriors had begun testing different points around the cabin, probing the defenses, and moving with the precision of experienced hunters. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. He noticed subtle patterns, the way they moved in groups, the signals they seemed to give each other, the way they adjusted their positions as if coordinating a silent attack. He whispered to the young woman, "Watch carefully. Learn what you can. Their movements can tell us a lot about their intentions." She followed his instructions, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, heart pounding with every subtle shift in the darkness. The night stretched on, tense and unyielding. The cowboy moved between the fire, the doors, and the windows, reinforcing weak points and preparing for the moment when the warriors might strike. He adjusted the lantern to cast just enough light to see without revealing their position. The young woman helped when he asked, handing him items quietly and observing his every move. Together, they created a rhythm of preparation and vigilance, a silent partnership born out of necessity and trust. Suddenly, a distant shout echoed across the plains, quickly silenced. The cowboy's head snapped toward the sound. He recognized it immediately, an attempt by the warriors to intimidate, to test their nerves, to force a reaction. He pressed his finger to his lips and whispered, "Do not respond. Not a sound. Let them think we are alone and unaware." The young woman swallowed hard, her pulse racing, but she obeyed. She understood that survival depended on control, patience, and composure. Even the smallest mistake could reveal their presence and put them at immediate risk. The cowboy moved closer to the door and peered through a crack in the wood. He saw several warriors approaching, moving carefully, examining the barricades, testing the strength of the cabin. He crouched low, his body tense but controlled. He whispered instructions to the young woman, guiding her through the safest positions in the cabin, showing her where to remain out of sight while still able to observe the movements outside. Her trust in him grew with every passing moment. She realized that fear was not her enemy. It was a signal to stay alert, to act with care, and to follow the guidance of someone experienced. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The wind carried faint noises from the surrounding plains, the shifting of boots on dry grass, the occasional whisper of command. The cowboy remained vigilant, listening for patterns, reading the movements, and predicting potential threats. He understood that the warriors' patience would not last forever. Eventually, they would take action, and when they did, it would test every bit of skill, courage, and intelligence he possessed. The young woman's courage began to grow. Each time she remained still under his guidance, each time she resisted the urge to move or speak, she felt a small victory within herself. She realized that survival was not just about physical protection. It was about mental control, awareness, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. The cowboy's presence was a constant reminder that she was not alone, and that together they could face challenges that might have seemed impossible alone. Finally, the cowboy made a decision. He crouched near the window and whispered, "It's time. We need to create a distraction, just long enough to move to a safer position. Trust me, and do exactly as I say." The young woman nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Her pulse raced, but she felt a strange clarity. Every instruction from him was a lifeline, every step measured to ensure they could survive the coming moments. The cowboy moved quietly, positioning a small lantern near the edge of the cabin and preparing a minor trap using the rope and stones he had gathered earlier. His plan was simple but clever. The lantern would draw attention, the trap would create noise and confusion, and together they would create an opening to move to a slightly safer location, hidden from the main body of the warriors. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and silent. The young woman followed his instructions perfectly, understanding that even the smallest misstep could be dangerous. As the first sparks of their distraction began to take effect, the shadows outside reacted immediately. A few warriors approached, investigating the light and sound, while the majority remained focused on the cabin itself. The cowboy remained calm, guiding the young woman step by step through the quiet movements they needed to make. She was tense but determined, her mind focused entirely on the plan, on his instructions, and on staying silent and unseen. The moment stretched, tense and fragile. Outside, the warriors adjusted to the disturbance, but their attention was drawn toward the distraction the cowboy had carefully created. Inside, he moved silently, checking that the young woman remained in position, ready for the next stage of their plan. Each step required precision, timing, and absolute focus. The slightest noise or hesitation could compromise everything they had prepared. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached a slightly safer position within the cabin, a spot less visible from the surrounding plains. The cowboy crouched beside the young woman, giving her a small nod of reassurance. "Well done," he whispered. "We've bought ourselves a little more time, but we must remain ready. The night is not over, and the warriors will not rest until they know what we are doing." She nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment and growing confidence. She realized that courage was not just about facing fear. It was about acting despite it, learning, observing, and surviving together. The rest of the night remained tense, but now with a glimmer of hope. The cowboy continued to guide the young woman through small adjustments in position, keeping them both safe and alert. The shadows of the warriors shifted outside, their presence constant and menacing, yet their focus was partially diverted by the clever distractions inside. The pair survived the night, not just with strength, but with strategy, patience, and trust. As the wind whispered through the plains and the stars continued to glow coldly above, the young woman felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. She had learned the importance of observation, patience, and trust. She had faced fear without giving in to panic, and she had survived, guided by the calm, clever, and courageous cowboy who had become both protector and mentor. By the end of the night, they had weathered the most intense part of the siege. The cowboy and the young woman were still safe, still vigilant, and still united in purpose. The plains around them were vast and dangerous, yet the cabin, small and fragile, had become a fortress of strategy and courage. The night had tested their limits, but it had also revealed their strength. The first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, casting a pale glow over the endless plains. The dark shadows of the night had faded, but the threat that had surrounded the cabin was still very real. Outside, the 400 warriors had not fully retreated. They lingered at the edges of the tall grasses, cautious and patient, aware that the night's disturbances were not mere accidents. Inside the cabin, the young woman sat close to the cowboy, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but alert, ready for whatever came next. She clutched his shirt tightly, the fabric now a symbol of safety and trust. The cowboy remained vigilant, crouched by the window, observing the warriors' positions. His mind was sharp, analyzing every movement, every shadow, every pattern of their approach. He knew that even though night had passed, their danger was far from over. The warriors had regrouped, and some were now actively seeking an opportunity to advance. He needed a plan, not just to survive, but to move beyond the cabin and escape the immediate threat. Survival depended on strategy, timing, and careful observation. He turned to the young woman, his expression calm but serious. "We can't stay here any longer," he whispered. "They've been cautious, but now they're more alert. If we want to make it out alive, we need to move while they're distracted. I have a route planned, but you must stay close and follow my lead exactly." She nodded without hesitation, trusting him completely. Fear was still present, but it was now joined by determination, a resolve to survive and escape together. The cowboy moved quickly but silently, gathering essential items, the rope, his small knife, and a water skin. He checked the barricades one final time, making sure that nothing would reveal their immediate absence. He pointed to a small, narrow path behind the cabin, partially hidden by tall grass and uneven terrain. "We'll follow that path. It leads to a ridge where we can see them without being seen. From there, we can decide our next step," he explained. The young woman nodded, understanding the importance of patience and careful movement. Outside, the warriors were divided. Some were investigating the cabin's interior disturbances, while others patrolled the outer perimeter. Their attention was scattered, and the cowboy recognized this as the perfect opportunity. "We move now," he whispered. He led the way to the back door, checking the ground for loose debris that might make noise. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid detection. The young woman followed closely, every muscle tense, every sense alert. As they slipped through the tall grasses, the early light of dawn softened the edges of the landscape, yet it also exposed them if they were careless. The cowboy's experience in the plains was evident. He knew how to use shadows, terrain, and vegetation to remain unseen. The young woman marveled at his skill, realizing that true survival was a combination of knowledge, patience, and courage. Every rustle of grass could be a warning, every distant noise a threat, yet their focus never wavered. The warriors outside were beginning to notice small signs of movement, but the cowboy's careful planning and the cabin's distractions had delayed their detection. He guided the young woman along the hidden path, occasionally pausing to ensure they were not being followed. His calm voice reassured her, even when her heart pounded with fear. "Keep moving slowly. Keep low. Trust me," he whispered. She obeyed step by step, learning to trust not only his guidance but her own ability to stay quiet and focused. As they reached the ridge, the view opened up. From this vantage point, the cowboy could see the entire area surrounding the cabin, the scattered movements of the warriors, and the safest direction to move next. He crouched, scanning for weaknesses, pathways, and any signs of pursuit. "We're not out of danger yet," he said softly, "but we have an advantage now. From here we can see them, and they can't see us." The young woman's eyes widened at the sight. The sheer number of warriors, their coordination, and their persistence. But she also felt hope. With careful planning and courage, they had survived the worst of the night. The cowboy guided her down the ridge and along a narrow, concealed path leading toward a small grove of trees in the distance. The trees offered cover and a chance to rest, regroup, and consider their next steps. As they moved, he taught her small survival skills: how to step lightly on the grass, how to read shadows, and how to detect the faintest signs of movement nearby. Each lesson was crucial, and the young woman absorbed them, growing more confident with every step. Finally, they reached the grove. The tree's thick trunks and leafy branches provided temporary safety, shielding them from view. They crouched beneath the cover, taking a moment to breathe. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she touched the ground, realizing that they had made it this far without being seen. The cowboy offered her a reassuring smile. "You've done well," he said. "This is the hardest part done. We're not completely safe yet, but we're out of immediate danger." She nodded, relief washing over her, but she remained alert, knowing that vigilance was still essential. As the sun rose higher, the warriors outside began to organize themselves, frustrated by the cabin's emptiness and the unexpected absence of their targets. Some approached cautiously, while others searched in wider arcs. The cowboy studied their movements carefully, noting patterns and identifying gaps in their coordination. He whispered to the young woman, "We need to keep moving, but slowly. We'll use the terrain to our advantage, and eventually we'll reach a safe place where we can signal for help if necessary." She listened intently, understanding the importance of patience and careful observation. They continued through the grove and into a shallow valley, using every shadow, every dip in the land, and every tree as cover. The young woman's confidence grew with each step, her trust in the cowboy deepening. She realized that bravery was not just about facing danger. It was about learning to survive, about relying on knowledge, and about trusting someone who had experience in situations far worse than her own. She began to move with more certainty, her fear still present but tempered by skill and guidance. After hours of careful navigation, they reached a ridge overlooking a distant river. The water glimmered in the morning light, a symbol of safety and a potential route to escape. The cowboy crouched, studying the surrounding plains one final time. "We can cross the river," he said softly, "and it will take us far from them. The current is strong, but it will carry us away and give us a chance to rest and recover." The young woman nodded, exhausted but resolute. Together they moved toward the river, using every cover available, avoiding any signs that might alert the warriors to their escape. When they finally reached the riverbank, the cowboy tested the current and found a shallow section where they could cross safely. He guided the young woman through the water, step by careful step. The river's cold touch was shocking, but it also felt cleansing, a way of leaving the danger behind. As they reached the other side, she let out a quiet sigh of relief, realizing that they had survived the night and the relentless pursuit of the warriors. On the far bank, they rested for a moment, the sun fully illuminating the landscape around them. The young woman looked back at the plains, at the cabin that had been their temporary fortress, and at the shadows that had threatened their lives. She clutched the cowboy's shirt again, a tangible reminder of protection, trust, and survival. The cowboy watched her with a small, approving smile. "You've been brave," he said. "Tonight, we faced something most people could never imagine, and we made it. That's courage." As they continued away from the river and toward safer territory, the young woman reflected on everything she had learned. Fear was powerful, but so was patience. Danger was relentless, but so was preparation and skill. And trust in someone who knew how to navigate impossible situations, was perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. She realized that the night's ordeal had changed her, had taught her lessons she would carry forever, and had forged a bond between her and the cowboy that could not be broken. Finally, they reached a small, hidden settlement, far enough from the plains to be safe for the moment. The cowboy guided her to a secure place where they could rest, recover, and begin the next chapter of their journey. The young woman looked back one last time at the vast plains, at the cabin, and at the shadows that had threatened them, feeling a mixture of relief, gratitude, and quiet triumph. They had survived together, not through luck, but through courage, strategy, and trust. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the world with its warm light, the young woman felt a sense of hope she had not felt in days. The ordeal was over, at least for now. They had faced overwhelming odds, and they had survived. And in that survival, they had discovered something more than safety. They had discovered resilience, courage, and the unbreakable strength that comes from facing danger together. The cowboy watched the horizon, vigilant even in the relative safety of the settlement. He knew that the world beyond the plains held new challenges, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had outsmarted the warriors, survived the siege, and come through the night together. The young woman rested beside him, exhausted but alive, her heart full of gratitude and a newfound courage that would stay with her forever. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the night's ordeal, they remained together, ready to face whatever came next, strengthened by the trials they had endured and by the trust and courage that had carried them through. The plains were vast, and danger could return, but for now, they had won. And that victory, quiet and hard-earned, was theirs to carry forward.